just an overview of what I want to go forward with within this session. This is not going to be a very in-depth about what each principle can look like and how do you mechanize each and every principle. I want this to be a larger overview of what principles are, how to use them, etc., etc. So, couple of things here. One, we're going to cover what are principles, just to get an understanding of what these arguments even look like. Secondly, how do you construct these arguments? Thirdly, just some ancillary things to keep in mind. I'm going to cover two principles, so like two large principles I'm going to talk about as examples or as certain like points of references. One is the principle of reparations. Second is the principle of responsibility. Two very fun principles to run in debates. And if you ever hear debates within like the circuit right now or most of the debates right now, I think these are the most common or popular principles used. Apart from a lot of other ones, of course, but I think these are two basic ones to understand and get a grasp of. Then we're going to learn about other relevant principles. I'm going to give you like few examples of what other principles could look like, apart from already covering two of them in depth. Lastly, coming to rebutting principles, and I think this is extremely important because even if people do get an understanding of what principles look like, most of us struggle in terms of how do you even respond to a well-established principle. Because generally speaking, if you establish a principle and ground it in a debate, it's debate winning in and of itself, and it becomes very difficult for the other team to go ahead and respond to them. But we're also going to cover what are the possible ways to rebut these principles if the other team has established a principle in a debate and has gone ahead and created a strong principle within that debate. Lastly, just a quick Q&A if you have any further questions after that. Although I like having questions in between like the slides, so that's something which we can probably incorporate within this. Cool. Let's move on to the next slide. What are principles? Right. So a couple of pointers. One, these are largely arguments which are not contingent on large scale consequences. And this is a bit tricky to get a hold of because there are two things to this. I think one, you'll oftentimes hear judges and hear people telling you that principles alone are unable to be debate winning. That if you establish a principle that, oh, this is principally something which is wrong or principally something which is correct, it is difficult to win a debate with that. You often need to ground it into impacts later on. And this is why there's a dichotomy in terms of how you view principles, because largely what principles are, they're independent arguments which don't need any certain consequences to occur. Like for example, right, if we go ahead and say that under this motion, if we go and proceed with this sort of law, we think a lot of poor individuals will be left with no money or will be left with no savings. I think this is a pragmatic impact you can probably push in any debate. The way principles are different is a principle might be that it's inherently wrong or morally incorrect to put the poor in a situation where they have to lose money. The way these things are different is that one is a pragmatic impact, that it has to rely on poor people actually being stripped, like taken, like money being taken away from poor individuals. Whereas the principle talks about that just the very act of it, just the very thought of it is morally incorrect. So what you can recognize here is that principles are often things which do not require any consequence to take place to be established. So if I have to establish something to be principally or morally incorrect, I don't need consequences to always support that. I think that's something which is principally incorrect or morally incorrect, stands morally incorrect, regardless of whether there's any outcome for it. But the second part of this is important. Oftentimes in debates, you can't necessarily win on principle by just establishing it. You often have to ground them into impacts. But the like what I want to differentiate here, grounding principles into impacts does not always mean you have to show very large consequences of it. Let's say I establish a principle, it does not mean that I always need to go forward and establish very large consequences within the principle to win, but I do need to show some sort of impact. And impact and consequences can be different when we look at principles. For example, consequence, something which we discuss, like literally taking away money from somebody, me picking up a bottle is a consequence of the act of me trying to pick up the bottle. The principle is that it's morally incorrect for me to do that action. So it questions the very act itself rather than relying on the action to take place. That's the inherent difference. But the grounding into impact looks like that to probably show why it matters in the debate, you often have to show that if that principle violation has occurred, what is the problem with it? Let's say you establish it's principally incorrect for me to pick that bottle up, but you have to show me why that matters or why that's going to be of a certain importance within that debate to individuals. Which means you can probably prove that the position of the bottle right now is so important for so many other individuals that the principal act or the principal idea of me even trying to pick up that bottle is so incorrect that it causes grave harm to the individuals who are there. So this is the way to perceive them, that it doesn't have to have large scale consequences to be true, but it does need to be grounded into some sort of impact or relevance within the debate for it to be important. That's the basic difference in terms of looking at what principled argumentations are. Secondly, they challenge the basic idea of maximizing utility and whether that is a desired metric. And this is extremely important. And before like fully understanding what this means, we have to understand what maximizing utility means. So the way to look at utility, and I think there can be a whole nother session on what utility looks like, what the frame of utility means to people, all those things. But largely maximizing utility means maximizing the amount of happiness or solace the act provides me. For example, I can probably say that hanging out with my friends makes me happy. It gives me utility, which means when I do hang out with my friends, it gives me something which is of importance to me. It gives me a utile value. It gives me something which is very important to me, or something which is very crucial to me, or something which makes me happy. So the way you measure happiness, or the way you measure something important, is how much utility does it provide to me. So of course there can be no literal way of measuring this, but the way you say that, oh, maximizing utility means maximizing my own benefit or my own happiness. What principles do is they challenge the very idea of maximizing utility. What they say is that, let's say, me going ahead and taking something away from an important individual does give me a lot of happiness. It does give me a lot of utility. But what principles say is that regardless of whether it provides me maximum utility, the act of taking that thing away from another individual is principally incorrect, which means it challenges the idea that maximizing utility is not always the metric, or not always the most important thing within a debate. For example, you can literally say, right, that doing this act is important because doing this act provides a lot of happiness or utility to this X individual. Principles say that we don't care if it provides you maximum utility if we can prove to you that it is principally incorrect thing to do. So the principles or principled argumentations challenge the very idea of maximizing utility, and they challenge the idea whether that's the only way to see that metric or see that debate, or that being the only metric within that debate. So to establish principles, you also have to keep in mind that you also have to establish that, one, what the principle is, and we'll get to that later on, but two, why is that the way to look at the debate? Why is that the metric to go and judge the debate? Why should I as a judge not say that, oh, the gov team is providing three benefits to this individual, maximizing utility. The op team is just telling me it's principally incorrect. Why should I care if it's giving me utility? That's the process of establishing a principle. Establishing it to such a degree that you can challenge the very idea of why utility does not necessarily matter. And this is very, very important, because this is how there's a large difference between a principled argumentation and a pragmatic argumentation. Pragmatic is literally a practical argument. Three things. I had one thing before, I have three things now, I have four things. It's an impact for me. Principle is challenging the very idea of that utility. So this is largely the idea of what utility looks like, what this idea challenges, and what not. Any issues with what utility means and what this challenge necessarily looks like? But I think this is crucial before we move forward. So let me know by unmuting or put in the chat um, if there's any doubt within this particular aspect. Also, I'm a bit old school, so in case all is clear, you can just give me a thumbs up or whatever. Yeah, go ahead. Deepshika, you can unmute.
Yeah. So if the opposite side goes ahead and establish weighing metric as numeracy, and then they prove that utility is the most important thing, why then and how like we can then ground principal arguments to win like on numeracy metric?
Correct. So the thing is, a lot of times the teams opposing a principle often try and use a metric of, let's say, numeracy, or oftentimes try to use like scale as a metric to win something. We're going to get to that later on in terms of how do you actually use principles to ground them. But a shorter answer for that is that necessarily principles are something, if well established, don't need to be literally weighed against a pragmatic argumentation. That's why I said that they individually win you debates, because a well established principles means that regardless of the outcome, or regardless of the numerical value they're able to achieve, it's something wrong. So it's kind of like prior to what the other team is saying. So the way you can probably weigh this looks like that: insofar as this is a principal violation and this matters to this individual, we don't think any form of numerical value or scalable impact to the other individual is necessarily the most important thing within the debate. And that largely relies on how you ground the principle and how you create the principle, something which you're going to come to in the second slide, of how you create a principle and largely how do you ground it in general. So I think once that is clear, we'll probably get back to this in case it's still a doubt. But that's the larger idea of how you can probably go ahead and do that. Let me know if that's, yeah, perfect. Cool. Any other doubts about this particular idea? Perfect. We'll go on. In case you have further doubts, just let me know whenever. Right. Lastly, they're often based on societal values which people stand by. And this is something which is important, but I must like clarify, this is not always true, but this is the larger idea of principles. I think, for example, that um, let's say people within a society necessarily value autonomy or necessarily value freedom, to speak something, to say something, to move somewhere, etc., etc. So the principle of autonomy or the principal idea that I should be able to choose whatever I wish to do is something which the society or the people living within that society necessarily believe for something to be true. So if people within India do value the idea of democracy, that's the only time when the principal notion of autonomy within the democracy can ever be important. And this is relatively simple, right? Because if, let's say, you live in North Korea, where the country is largely autocratic, largely undemocratic, where people don't have inherent rights, it's very difficult to then say that people within that are are valuing the idea of autonomy. So not saying that they don't want autonomy, they probably do, but do they value it in the current status quo? That's the most important thing to them. Probably not, or as much, not as much as people value this probably within India. So probably if tomorrow you take away my right to probably walk from X place to Y place, that's something which is a much graver harm to me on a principal notion than doing the same thing in certain other area where it's already been done. So principles often revolve about things where, of what people think are the correct things to do within society. For example, equality is something which the larger society does believe to be true, or believe to be important. That people should have equal opportunities or equal, chances, etc., etc. Which means within that, because the society does value that, the principal notion around equality or equal chances then becomes important. So, and this is very important in terms of framing, because in any debate where you have to run principles, I think rather probably any argument, you do need to go and frame a lot of stuff in first speech in terms of what the world looks like, what the current status quo looks like, who are the stakeholders, what's the current scenario, etc., etc. So, and this is linking to the first step of creating a principle, which we're going to get to in the next slide. That's where you need to show that what is this, that something society necessarily values, why is it of importance, and why within that setup is this principle you're going and targeting necessarily relevant within that itself. So that's the idea of it being based on societal values. Of course, if you can obviously prove certain principles that regardless of whether people value it or not, it's an inherent right which is like something which is of a greater thing than whether people value it or not. So as to say that we don't care if the people value it in the society or in that particular country, this is a right which every human being should have. There are principles which can be met out this way, but oftentimes you'll see principles on notions which are societally accepted or seen as good. So that's the idea around this, not something not which is extremely true at all cases, but in majority cases you will see principles around those notions. Of course there are exceptions, we can probably discuss that while referencing to debates. But the second aspect of this slide is actually probably more important. What principles are absolutely not? And this is important because through my experience I've seen that, and including me, for the first year of my debating, I ran principles wrong a lot of times. So a lot of times I ran principles thinking this is debate winning, but because I did not run them the way they should be run, they were nothing but statements. And hence a judge going ahead and valuing that or prioritizing that within the judging of the debate is never going to happen. So there are two aspects which in this, and there are multiple ways to do principles wrong, but the two larger thing which I've noticed is, one, principles are not statements which sound correct. So just saying that equality is important and this compromises equality, that's not a principle. That's a statement which might be true. I mean, as a team, if you tell me that equality is important, this violates equality and it's wrong, I'm unsure why. Because the other team can simply say, we agree it violates equality or this equality of opportunity, but it's for a greater good. Or they can probably just say that this has to happen regardless. No side can prove that it won't happen. Things like this. Which means your statement, even though it sounds intuitively very correct morally, It's not a principled argumentation till the time the other side can easily flip it up or just create mechanization which beats the larger idea of it. So just something which sounds correct does not make it a principle. There's a whole process needs to be established to get to it being an actual principled argument rather than something which sounds principally and morally correct. There's a larger difference between that. And this is the biggest mistake which people do make, including me. When I used to go first speaker, I used to say that, oh, the principal idea within this debate is that op is wrong because they violate equality. I mean, good debaters can just come in DLO and say, so what? Because insofar as they achieve the impacts which they prove to be more important, this statement then becomes irrelevant within the debate. So it's very important to understand a difference that it requires a lot of work to create a principle apart from establishing the one liner of it. Secondly, niche ideas which may be subjectively important to individuals. And this looks like this, right? I think a lot of times there may be niche things which are important to me, but probably not important to all of you, or vice versa, right? Which means simply saying that, oh, moving my phone from here to the bed is principally incorrect because that's something I value of my phone being in a particular place, is not really a principle. It's something which is important to me, but I'm unsure as to why that becomes a principle or why you all care about that. So there are two ways to deal with this. Either within the debate, you prove something to be so much importance to an individual that the violation of that right or violation of how things needed to be for that individual is a principle, which oftentimes is a very, very tough thing to do, which is why I link it back to societal values, which is why it's intuitively more easier to prove something or prove a principle which is societally seen as a right thing or morally correct thing within that particular status quo we're talking about. So you can't run principle about very niche ideas which are subjectively important. Oftentimes principles rely objective values to be created for it to stand. So subjective things which may be of importance to me without proving why it's the most relevant thing are oftentimes not considered principles within debates. So these are two things not to do when you run principles and what principles are largely not. So this is the idea of what principles look like, what principles do not look like, and largely around that. Any further doubts on this or like what principled argumentations are, what they're not, anything around this? In case it's clear, just let me know by some sort of. Go ahead, Sanvi. You have a doubt or okay? I think you lowered your hand.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Actually, my laptop hung up, so I'm really sorry. It's clear. You can go ahead. Thank you.
No worries. All right, perfect. Cool. We can move to the next slide then. Cool. This is the main part of the session of how do you even construct principles, because and these three things operate after you identifying a principle. The reason I don't have identification of a principle as a separate step, because very honestly speaking, that's something which becomes very intuitive in the sense that I don't think there is particular way to see a motion and follow steps to identify whether there's a principle in it. I think the way you identify principles is first by familiarizing yourself with multiple principles in general. So two of which we're going to cover here. I'm going to give you examples of 5, 6 more. The more you familiarize with yourself with the idea of those principles, the more quicker you're able to link that within a debate. So we'll take examples which might clear that up. But this necessarily happens after you have identified the correct principle within a debate. Let's say you see a debate which talks about colonialism, of how, let's say, colonies were established within countries and they were largely exploited for the benefit of the countries which colonized those countries. You can probably instantly see that this talks about these countries who have colonized other countries owing something back to countries like India, for example, who was colonized because they gained from harming this country, which means they owe some sort of reparations to them. So the instant click in your mind when you see the idea of colonialism or whatever is probably talking to you about the reason why they owe something here is probably because they owe reparations to that country because of colonialism. So we'll get to the idea of reparations, which might like kind of clear that up. But I think the gist to establish is that the more you're aware about different principles and what they look like, the quicker you be able to connect that with the motion you're talking about. So I think after this session, you'll probably have a larger idea of what principles look like, and then you'll probably be able to connect them with different motions or whatever it is. So I think this how to construct principles necessarily starts after that basic prerequisite being met. Let's say you identified the principle. This, you know what, this is the one to be run within this debate on either side. Now, how do you even construct that principle to be relevant within the debate, or to probably go ahead and like speak about it and talk about it within the debate? Three ideas here. One is what is the theoretical idea of the principle. Secondly, linking that principle to the motion or to the side of the motion you're talking about. And thirdly, proving why that the principle is important within the debate and weighing it over other things within the debate largely. First is a theoretical idea. And there are three basic questions which answers this. One, what is the principle? And this links to identification. Secondly, what does it look like in terms of breaking it down and establishing what it looks like for individuals? What is the theoretical idea of the principle? But thirdly, what is the criteria for the fulfillment of this principle in status quo? We'll go like one by one, like around each of these things. One, what is the principle? I think I've already talked about necessarily establishing the link between identifying the principle and necessarily seeing whether it fits within the motion. So probably seeing that, okay, if the principle is principle of reparation, what is that principle? So questioning that in terms of that principle largely talks about why countries who have colonized other countries owe something back to these countries on a principle basis, because they are the ones who have benefited by exploiting these countries largely. Once you've like not necessarily understood that the principle within this debate is the principle of reparations, you go to the next step. What does this even look like? And this is very simple. So the thing is, the way I see analysis, mech, or analyzing principles, I necessarily base it around 4 to 5 very basic questions: what, where, how, when, and other basic questions like this. And the reason these are important, this may sound dumb, but this is literally the way I've debated since I was like in fifth grade, whether it's conventional debates or parliamentary debates, is they often come down to these very simple questions. The motion might be very, very complex. It might talk about very complex ideas. But oftentimes, when judges say that your team missed analysis or missed mechanization, it's oftentimes what they mean to say is that your team failed to prove or link these very basic questions. What is this motion talking about? Where does this necessarily operate? How does this necessarily accrue? Who does this necessarily affect? So if you see, by answering these 4 questions, you've answered things like stakeholders, analysis, impact, and weighing. So all these basic concepts of parliamentary debating necessarily operate around these basic questions of like what, where, how, who, and when. Now, the same applies to principles. When we say what does it look like, you have to necessarily think about things that what is the theoretical idea of this principle? Like if it's talking about reparation, what does this reparation look like? Are we talking about countries literally being paid a check? It's not necessarily about that, right? It's probably about the idea, the acknowledgement of owing something to countries. So I'm not sure if you watch this one video of Shashi Tharoor, where there's a 15-minute speech that Shashi Tharoor gives in some sort of debate happening, I think in Oxford, if I'm not wrong, where he talks about reparations and where he talks about the idea of, actually, I'll probably give a shout out to Shashi Tharoor in a separate analysis I'm going to do in next show, but I briefly cover it here, is that the idea of owing some sort of reparation is very different from the act of paying the reparation. So if you're talking about the principle of reparation, it does not necessarily mean that you literally have to pay $1 billion to India. It's the idea of acknowledging that something needs to be owed as forms of reparation. So this answers the second question here. That the theoretical idea of this principle is necessarily around the idea that because of the harms which were like done by these countries, they do owe something to these countries. What it looks like is Britain acknowledging the problems it created in India, or Britain is acknowledging the problem it created in a lot of African colonies that they created. Things like these. So what it looks like means visualizing what this means in the real world or what it means in the current world. Because it's easier to say, oh, principle of reparation. What does that mean? It probably means that you look at it today, oftentimes you can see that a lot of colonies or a lot of countries who did colonize other countries are now developed, are now very growing at a rapid rate. So it probably means that the growth has come after the exploitation of the countries they colonize, right? Which means this reparation principle probably looks like, again, as I said, Britain owing something to India, right? So visualizing what the principle is within today's world is this sort of idea of what this principle means and what this necessarily looks like. This is the first step to constructing a principle, that you see the principle, identify the principles, and necessarily talk about it at what it even means, what it looks like. So, and it's different from what happens when, like, so this is a difference, right? What it looks like does not mean what happens if the principle is necessarily done. So you don't talk about, oh, if England owes something to India and once they pay India, what will happen? No, it's talking about the general acknowledgement of it. That you know that countries have colonized other countries. What does this reparation look like today? Like if it had to be done, who are we talking about? So again, breaking down the basic questions: who, what, where, and how. Like who does this affect? Who are we talking about? Where does this occur in current world? Where did this happen? All these things. Thirdly, what is the criteria for fulfillment in status quo? And this is very important because principles can't be arbitrary ideas. So you can't just say, oh, this is principally incorrect, without ever showing that how is that ever achieved, in the sense that, like, the criteria to fulfill in status quo the principle of reparation is a lot of times along the lines of, when in UN meetings, a lot of time countries have gone and acknowledged that these were the harms caused by us to other countries, or maybe even if the country does not acknowledge it, probably forcing the country by other UN factors or other large countries that you did do this and hence you do owe something in terms of reparation to these other countries, are normal acts in the way you go and achieve this sort of principle. So let's say the principle is of agency, for example, that I as an individual should have the agency, should have the autonomy, uh, to speak whatever I want, to walk from one place to another, to travel to different cities, etc., etc. What is the criteria for fulfillment in status quo? Which means in the current world, what is the criteria for me to achieve this agency? It probably looks like me having the option to go from one place to another, me having the option to go out and speak to my friends about anything I want without facing consequences for it. So what have we done right now? We've taken the principle of agency, and talked about the violation of agency. We've talked about what does it look like. It looks like violating the sort of agency and violating the option of individuals. But thirdly, we've talked about the criteria for fulfilling this is allowing individuals to take this step, to talk to people, etc., etc. So the way we've broken it down is that the criteria to fulfill the principle of agency is to have no restrictions on people to go ahead and do whatever they want in terms of going from one place to another or talking to people, etc. That's the way you go ahead and achieve this principle in real life. Let's say we're talking about India as a democratic country. We can say that, listen, people within this country have the right to go wherever they want, to shift to different cities, to go ahead and, let's say, talk to other individuals about various topics without having to face repercussions for it. Let's say the motion talks about stopping individuals migrating from place A to place B. What you can say is that this principle violates the principle of agency, and the way it does operate in status quo. So ये is like it's to prove कि जो हम बोल रहे हैं, it's not necessarily just in the air, it is given within status quo. So अभी तक ये agency दी जाती थी in ways which we just talked about, but if you stop people from migrating from place A to place B, you're violating this agency because you're now stripping away the rights from these people to go from place A to place B. That's the principle. That you see what the principle looks like, you talk about how it's necessarily given as a right within status quo, and thirdly, to achieve that, you have to keep allowing that to individuals on a regular basis. When you stop allowing that, you break the principle of agency. This is the first step to understand the theoretical idea of the principle. In theory, what does it mean? How does it apply within world? What does it necessarily look like? Just very basic questions. And this is largely a part of framing. How do you frame principles? You frame it around these very basic theoretical ideas. Now coming to the second step, once you've done that, you now have to link that principle with the motion. Let's continue with this motion that we just took, right? Migrating, and like, and this is a motion which I think is debated quite often. I don't remember the exact principle, but I've seen it in a lot of tournaments where the motion revolves around that, to solve, let's say, population issues in urban areas like Mumbai or Delhi, where there's a lot of labor population comes from other cities. You're necessarily going to stop this sort of migration from other cities to these large urban centers. The debate oftentimes is about, you do that because it saves people from exploitation within these large cities. It forces governments to develop rural areas where the people now can't move from to other places, etc., etc. And the gov necessarily, or the opposition, which says this is a wrong thing, often argues the principle that this violates the principle of agency. Now you link it with the motion that once you've established what the principle of agency looks like within status quo, what the idea of principle of agency means, now you go ahead and link it what the motion talks about. The first thing in this is measuring criteria needs to be established. And this is operating in a way where you necessarily need to establish a criteria in which you measure the way the principle operates. So, for example, within this motion, the way I'm going to link this is by saying that if on site government you do take this policy step to stop people going from one place to another in the pursuit of solving the issues of the past, you're doing two things. One, you are violating the principle of agency of these individuals for something which they have not caused. And this is important, right? Because what do you understand from the motion? You're talking in the motion, like the sides are saying that oh, stop this migration for a greater good. The other side is saying that no, freedom is important, agency is important, and without that, you're going to cause grave harms to these individuals. But I think what's important to establish from opposition, if you're arguing a principle, is that the reason why this violation of agency is wrong is not only because it's literal violation of the principle, which is we've already talked about, but secondly, do these people even deserve that? In the sense that have these people caused the issue which government wants to solve? So, for example, if Gov is saying that, oh, we want to solve issues of overpopulation and we want to solve issues of exploitation, I think it's very fair to say on opposition that the reason for this exploitation is literal government structures, is not these individuals, is the failure of government structures to go ahead and allow these individuals to grow or allow these individuals to sustain their lives, or the failure on the government's part to not develop rural areas enough. Because the reason why people move is because of lack of opportunities, right? So because opportunities unko nahi mili hai, isliye wo jate hain, which means you're violating the principle of this agency and freedom due to something which these people have are not the cause of, which is a graver harm. So now the measuring criteria is established in the sense that the reason why this is a graver harm is because it's not proportional to the acts of these people. And we're going to come to this also, that principles need to be proportional in the sense that to say that this is principally and morally incorrect, or let's say reparations have to be given to the same gravity in terms of what they were caused. So let's say England exploited India a lot. So the moral obligation to repay those things are now going to be higher, because of course you exploited India so much that that's the amount of literal reparations you owe. And this is again not always in the case of this is the amount of dollars I owe, but pushing the criteria, this is on an urgent basis, you need to owe that reparation as a moral thing because of the harms you've caused. So it needs to be proportional. There can't be a disproportionate burden on any individual to fulfill a principle. So again, coming back to this, and the second part is even further more important: the ways to achieve criterion world being defended. Opposition within the debate of migration is defending a world where you continue to allow these people to migrate and you don't stop that under the policy of government. The way you need to achieve the criteria which you have established of agency is to say that in our world where you don't disallow the individuals to travel, you can do two things. One, you can continue to allow these principles the right to agency and right to freedom to move, while also probably having alternate measures to solve the government's issue. Because government issue kya hai? Overpopulation ho jati hai and exploitation face karni padti hai logon ko when they go to urban areas. You can probably say that you continue to provide these people the right to autonomy and freedom, while also developing structures which solves the very issues. Probably looks like developing suburban areas outside large urban areas to allow population to grow like and disperse, rather than it being in very like small areas and densely populated areas. That's one way to see it, right? What have we done till now? We have talked about the theoretical idea of what this agency looks like. We've talked about what this agency looks like within status quo. How is it given to individuals? Secondly, we've talked about how we've linked it to the motion that this theoretical idea or idea of this agency is violated under this motion or at the side of the government. And secondly, the way we can continue to achieve that principle on our side is when you don't disallow the individuals to go from one place to another. They continue to do that whenever they feel like is required for their own needs, but also the needs of the country, and they continue to fulfill the criteria for that principle to be achieved. That's how you go and link it with the motion, with this sort of analysis. Before I move to third step, any issues with these first two steps, or largely the ideas around these first two things? This can be a lot to like absorb, so feel free to ask any questions, and they don't have to be very technical. Any sort of questions are relevant, so let me know if there are any doubts here. Yep, go ahead, Deepsika.
Can you give like some simple example as to how we like link it with motion? It was थोड़ा सा complicated, I think.
Okay. Hmm. Hmm, reparations. ठीक है. Cool. We can talk about a principle which is about responsibility. That's also a principle we are going to cover. The way responsibility operates is by saying that, for example, parents have an inherent responsibility and obligation to their children, which is to say that parents are required to go ahead and fulfill basic needs of children, take care of those children, etc., etc. It's an inherent obligation which parents owe to children. There are two reasons for it. One, because the children who are born, uh, and this may sound a little weird, but these children who are born did not consent to being born, right? You didn't take their consent before getting them to this world, which means they are people or individuals who have no rights of their own or no freedom of their own till now, which is why parents owe an inherent obligation to them. Now let's come to this idea, right? The theoretical idea of this responsibility or obligation can be literally explained the way I did. This obligation looks like parents owing obligations to children because children did not consent to being born, and the parents are the people who took that decision for them. Hence, this sort of disproportionate thing, which is their relationship, which is there between these individuals, forces these parents to be inherently obligated to take care of them. That's talking about a theoretical idea. Now, coming to the linking with the motion. For example, let's take a motion around this idea that, let's say, a motion talks about uh, parents being able to offset the burden of taking care of children to NGOs. Let's say, uh, if parents realize that, oh, I can't take care of my child, now I'll give it to an NGO or I'll give it for adoption. The way you can link it with this motion is by saying, if you allow that to happen, you are violating this inherent obligation slash responsibility which parents have towards their children. Because अब तुम ये बोल रहे हो that as parents I can let go of my children responsibility to other individuals, but that's wrong, because that breaks the very principle that these parents are the ones who are inherently responsible to take care of their children and not governmental organizations. And the way I've linked this is by first establishing what this looks like. So the way I established it by saying, okay, listen, there's a disproportionate harm because these children did not consent to being born. Hence, I am as a parent obligated to take care of them. Once you break that obligation by allowing this offset to other government organizations or anything else, or adoption centers, you break this chain of obligation which I have. That is wrong, because for no fault of their children, they're going to be in the hands of these NGOs which you don't know how they're going to operate, and you break that sort of chain with these parents. So the linking is contingent on you first proving the theoretical idea. Once you prove the theoretical idea, then you can say that in your world, when you allow this sort of policy to happen and you can offset children to governmental organization, you're breaking the very obligation which parents have to their children. And the ways to achieve the criteria in a world being defended looks like this, that the way in our world or in the world where you don't allow this to happen, I can achieve the principle which I'm talking about, because parents now are, they can't give the children to anybody else, which means the obligation they owe to their children continues to exist. It doesn't go away. That's the way to achieve the second part of linking with the motion. So you take the idea, you prove what it looks like or what the idea necessarily looks like in terms of responsibility. You say how it gets violated in the other side, and you prove or you talk about how you can probably pursue it further and you can continue for it to exist in your world. That's the way to look at it. So one, create the principle, talk about the theoretical idea of it. Second, talk about how that principle necessarily gets violated or goes away in the other side. And thirdly, prove why it does not go away in your side and continues to be established. Those are the three steps to complete the first two ideas within this. Was that a bit clear? Cool. Perfect. Any other doubts within this? What does measuring criteria look like? Cool. So the idea of a measuring criteria does not necessarily mean that, so for example, I talked about utility, right? That the way you can measure utility, oh, this gives me a lot of happiness, etc., etc. So this is not very similar to that. A measuring criteria basically means that how do you necessarily see the violation of this principle mattering? For example, if this principle is violated, what is the problem with it? So like, what is the inherent harm with it? So there is a measuring criteria you're seeing with the violation of the principle, or with the principle going or staying in and of itself. The second part of achieving the same criteria in the world which you are defending is by saying that the way I, in my world, I'm able to achieve the same criteria is because I'm allowing the same rights as they were allowed pehle. So, for example, the migration motion, in ops world, where this policy of stopping migration does not occur, in ops world, this right continues to exist as much as it did pehle. So, जितना वो principle का value पहले था, उतना ही principle का value अभी भी रहेगा, which is why it's important or good, which is why op is saying it's a good thing. That ये principle right है, जितनी पहले थी उतनी ही अभी allow होनी चाहिए, and that's a good thing. That's the way the measuring criteria necessarily, what I mean by measuring criteria within this linking. The amount of that principle contributed pehle should be the necessarily same and you have to show why it continues to exist in the same way in your world. If you there's analysis which showcases, if the other side can say that, listen, you talk about this principle, but even in your paradigm under this motion, this principle right continues to deter or go down. That's a problem. Because let's say I talk about agency, right? I say, okay, oh no, agency is very important, agency looks like this, in Gov's world agency goes away. If, and this is a very good flip on government, right? Government can say that if you don't take a step right now to solve the issues within rural areas, or solve the issues of overpopulation, people are actually going to be unable to move. वैसे ही, for example, I am somebody who's right now in Delhi, or let's say I'm in a smaller town like Chandigarh, for example. I want to shift to Mumbai. Under the migration, like right now how it operates, is that I have the autonomy or freedom to go to Mumbai. Why is that? Because there is some amount of space left in Mumbai for me as an individual to go and exist, right? If Gov can prove that if you don't take a step right now and people continue to move regardless, in the future this sort of right is going to go away because जगह ही नहीं बचेगी, जाओगे कहाँ? So tomorrow, if 10 years down the line, I want to move to Bombay, but there is no job for me, there is no house for me, there is no space for me, I can't move. Which means Gov can prove that even the principle you want to establish kind of will go away regardless. This is where the measuring criteria is hampered. Because if Gov is proving that anyways your principle is going to get harmed regardless, or the value of the principle is going to go down if you don't solve the issue, then it's a problem. Which is why within this linking with the motion, the second burden which I talked about becomes important. How do you prove that this principle in your world continues to exist at the same level as it did before? That's the way to weigh this up. So if government or the other side can prove why the principle's value within that world continues to go down, then that principle becomes slightly a weaker principle, or you are now vulnerable in that debate. Because you've been unable, you've told me why they violate the principle, that's fair, but you're unable to show me why the principle remains in your world. That's a half burden fulfilled. And principles ko half run karna is kind of worse than like not running them at all. Because now once you've done is that you spent so much time establishing the principle, but if you miss the part of proving why it stays in your world, it's just very easy to rebut as the other side. I can just say, sure, that's true, but it goes away regardless, so it's not important. Which is why it's important to establish that, and which is the second thing with my alternative become important, right? Op can say that let the right remain, but it's the government responsibility to solve this issue. If those issues keep getting solved by creating suburban areas or whatever it is, I think this principal right can continue to exist for years to come. People will still be allowed to go to one place to another. And the second analysis to that can also be that people don't always just move from Chandigarh to Mumbai, right? Sure, the number of people moving to bigger centers might be more, but people often move the other way around as well. Why is that? Because governments have been coming up with call centers, coming up with IT sectors, coming up with manufacturing units, often in rural areas or often in newer areas which are industrial sectors within the country. Which means there is also movement from these big cities to these small cities. And this is why, as opposition, you can say, as long as this continues to happen, I think there will be enough space for people to keep moving. Hence, the autonomy and freedom stays in our world. It never really goes away. Now it becomes the principle which is important. You've created the first step, you created the second step, and you've shown why it necessarily doesn't go down as a measuring criteria largely. So this is about the measuring criteria and the value of things in one world or the other. Is that clear, or anything like any further doubts?
Yes, yes, it is clear.
Perfect. Cool. Any other doubts here? If not, we'll move to the last step within this. Cool. Moving to the last thing within this. The last step to construct a principle is necessarily thinking about the importance of it. Sub bata diya, agency looks like this is how it's violated, this is how it stays. The biggest question in the debate is literally, so what? And it's very simple, right? You can spend 10 minutes of beautiful analysis on showing me a principle. Without you showing me why it matters in the debate, it is irrelevant. So, for example, in this debate, if you continue to go and talk about agency, without telling me what's the value of it, why does it even matter? If the other side says, okay, but what's the problem with it, even if it's violated? This is where this last step becomes important. There are three ideas within this. One, you explain the reasons to care about it. This can look like the reason why agency is important to individuals is because that's literally what continues to push these people to care about the larger society. If I continue to get my rights, the right to freedom, right to speech, right to live, that's the only way I will push myself to grow as an individual, to work on my own things, and subsequently contribute to the larger development of society as well. Because जब individuals grow करेंगे, that's the only way society will grow largely, right? So the reason why you have to care about my agency is because one, that's the only way the larger society necessarily benefits. But secondly, it can also look like um, there being, and this disproportionality operates in a lot of factors. I think we just talked about the children wala aspect. Similarly, it can operate here. There's a disproportionate way this relationship operates between me as an individual and the government within my within my country, because the governments probably take a lot of decisions for me without me being actively involved. For example, the country's foreign policy, right? Or the country's policy making in large, right? I vote them into power, but what they subsequently do with that power is probably upon them, which means there's a disproportionate relationship here, which is why I am a vulnerable individual within this sort of debate, talking about government and society and individuals at large, which is why the principal right to my agency and freedom does matter a lot within this debate because of me being a vulnerable actor due to this disproportionality within this relationship. So one, it can literally be that without that right, other things happening in the society becomes irrelevant or can't happen. Secondly, is probably be looking at how it is disproportionate, and thirdly, it can also be that it can also operate around the idea of consent, right? That, and this is where the children example becomes important. If these children are people who did not consent to being in a position where they are right now, they probably do deserve rights, because without that, they're creatures with nothing, right? Because as you can prove, children are people who are don't consent to being born. Their right to have a decent life, or to have a life which is equitable, is important, because they did not consent to being in the position where they are today. These are a couple of examples to prove this, or explaining reasons why you have to care about something. And this is often going to be under the context of under the garb of the motion. So it depends on what motion we're talking about to necessarily understand how to prove importance. If you're talking about reparations, the way to prove importance is by saying that, again, also be things like forceful intrusion. I don't think India necessarily was prepared or allowed or literally said, "Oh, come and like exploit us." It was done as a forceful measure, which means people within that time were vulnerable. Secondly, had that not occurred, had that colonization not occurred, India as a country probably would have been 100 years ahead of where we are now, or probably the process of development might have been quicker, right? What these things tell you is that the reason why that reparation is so important is because the harms were so grave. People literally died within that colonization, right? People were harmed on a daily basis. Our resources were stripped away. So the way you're proving reasons to care about that principle is by showing me how vulnerable the harms were when that principle did not occur, or when the violations within that principle did occur. These are giving reasons of why, as a judge, I should care about what you're telling me. And this can literally looks like things which happened in the past, why they were wrong, who are the actors we are talking about, why are they so much more vulnerable than other actors. So probably in the example I just gave, it's easy to prove why individuals are more vulnerable than governments, right? As stakeholders, and hence the rights of individuals become more important. That's the first thing which in proving importance. Second, and it's general, has to be in larger context of the motion. So importance can't be just very niche ideas again, right? It can't be that, oh, the right to autonomy, like of myself, is important because I think I value a lot. No, it has to be in the larger context of the motion. Why do you as a individual matter within the debate which talks about political rights, or which talks about rights of equality? It's because you are the building block of the society we are talking about. So when you give a reasoning, it has to be in the larger context of the motion, which is why I always say, like, in any speech or in any matter you're trying to establish, always in the back of your mind, have a very clear understanding of what side of the motion you're talking about. So you can keep linking back to it, right? And by linking back, I don't mean that every line you explain, oh, this is why it happens. It's always having a larger idea in your mind that what is the side which I have to defend, what is the side which I have to talk about, and continue to go and clear the idea of give reasoning into the larger context of that. So always remember you're operating under the GA where you have to prove reparations to be good or reparations to be important. Now, when you give reasons, you have to give reasons under the larger context of that motion, not something which is operating bahar uske. So creating a bubble within that motion of out of which you can't operate is important, ताकि all your arguments are within that bubble and within that garb which you have to operate under. Lastly, this is a way you can prove importance again, equating principle with an important social construct. And this is really, really fun, right? Because you can also prove the importance of a principle by saying that, for example, let's take right to choice here, right? Right to choice, which means the ability for me to choose between options or having the ability to choose things for myself, is a principle and inherent obligation. The way you can probably prove that to be important is by equating that with something which is of larger importance as compared to this, or something which people value a lot. For example, right to life. I think it's very intuitive to argue, and I think it's very easy to establish why living matters, right? Why right to life is important. The way you can prove the importance of right to choice is by convincing the judge that right to choice probably matters as much as right to life does. How do you do that? A couple of ways. You can say that having choice to do things for individuals often becomes a prerequisite for them to do anything in life. For example, when I go to school, right, the option of going ahead and taking an education, or the option of me going out of my house and going to the school, allows me things which are as basic as living. Because I think it's very easy to say that um, things like talking, things like moving from a place to another, things like freedom are as important to living, because without these things there is no meaning of life. And this is how your equation happens, right? You have to prove why the choice to do things needs to exist, because without that choice I don't think I can make any value of my life. Which means when you violate my choice or right to choice, you're actually violating my ability to live to the fullest potential. So, for example, if today I have a choice uh, to choose between this government to vote for, or I can vote for another government, I have the choice to vote, right? I have the choice to vote between multiple parties. The way you can prove why it's equal, if it's of equal importance to a right to life, is by saying that the government which I put my trust in literally dictates everything for me. What policy I'm going to operate under, how much money can I spend, how expensive are things going to be for me, what rights do I even have, are we continuing to follow the same constitution, what sort of new policies will affect me, all these things. And I think all these things are very fundamental to a person's life. Because tomorrow, if you say that, listen, you can't go out of these four walls, that's very fundamental. The ability for me to go out is important, because without talking to individuals, I think I probably will go insane. Which means these sort of things are important for me to live, not just breathing, but the value I gain within that life. So if I can prove that if you take away the choice, the right to choice, or the right to agency, or the right to freedom, you are taking away my right to live, because without that ability there is no value to my life. The reason why this is an excellent way to prove importance is because you're telling me as a judge that what I'm talking about does not necessarily matter only because, oh, choice honi chahiye. No, because it matters as much as basic things like living matters. So this is another way how you can prove importance of a principle, by equating it with another social construct which is of equal importance, such as right to life. So that's the larger idea of importance. Any doubts within this? Because might be a bit tricky to understand. Uh, so let me know in case any doubts, any specific questions. There'll be ample examples we're going to cover, like motions case, that might make it even more clearer. But any doubts on the theory idea of this? Cool. Just waiting for 10 more seconds, and then I'll go forward to the next slide. Cool. So theoretical idea linking with the motion and proving importance. Three fundamentals to constructing any sort of principle with any sort of debate. Once that is done, we'll move to the next slide now. Other things to keep in mind, and generic things, but oftentimes that people miss. One, identifying principle always a prerequisite to everything else. And something we talked about, right? Identification of principles is often intuitive. The more principles you're aware of, the faster you're able to see that whether this motion can, like the principle can fit into this motion or not. So if you don't identify the correct principle, it often leads to other things not mattering. Because let's say I identify the wrong principle, then even if I do the 3 step which we talked about in the previous slide, it doesn't really matter, right? Because agar jahan right to autonomy chalani thi, agar main right to choice chala ke aa gaya, so it won't matter as much or value as much in that debate. Which is why identifying principle is a prerequisite to everything else. And honestly, I thought a lot about how there are ways where you can explain how you can identify principles like as steps. And I don't think there are particular ways to identify principles step by step. कि ये करके समझ आ जाएगा यहाँ principle ही है. It's genuinely very intuitive. And once you have an understanding of larger understanding of basic principles कि ये होता है, you're able to link it quicker with other things. Which is why I'm covering two very basic things like reparation and responsibility, because that is those are principles which can be used in multiple variety of motion and different themes. Hence, the identification does not become that much of a problem. Second, rhetorics matter, and this is funny because the first thing, and just a quick story here. I debated a lot of conventional debates and a lot of MUNs, and I was hated on it from my friends about it. But when I came to parliamentary debating, in the first session which was taken by my seniors, they told me specifically that parliamentary debates are not about the way you speak, but more about what you speak. And that's necessarily very true. That the reason why parliamentary debates are excellent is because they don't value things like dramatics, voice modulation, and all those things. What matters more is what are the points you're proving, what are the logic of your analysis, and all those things. But the reason why I think rhetorics matter and they do provide value is that, and first of all, like just to get a brief understanding what rhetorics mean, rhetorics are different from just things like jargon, right? Like you must be hearing, oh, this is just jargon. Jargon are just random statements in a debate which might sound correct, but they're of no value. Rhetorics, on the other hand, are often used as a negative thing, but rhetorics generally mean that you use the ability of your oratory skills to support the argument. And I want to continue to establish the argument matters the most. So don't like get me wrong here. It doesn't matter the way you speak always. What I'm talking about here is that if you have a very good argument of principle, oftentimes the way you deliver it does make an impact. So for example, if you're talking about something as basic as the right to life, right, or the right to freedom, if you just say it as like, oh, right to freedom matters, it's probably not as impactful as compared to being a little more emotive about it. To say that freedom is literally the basic essence of human life, which means the way you achieve that becomes important for individuals to lead a good life. So probably impacting things a little further rhetorically becomes important to persuade the judges that this is important. So this is different from jargon or voice modulation in the way you speak. It's about stressing on things which are of importance and delivering it in a way which can persuade judges. So as contrary to like a larger popular belief that they don't matter at all, I do think rhetorics matter in principled arguments, because principled arguments are largely very emotive. They're talking about rights, they're talking about freedom, they're talking about past which are very impactful to a lot of individuals. So these things do require some sort of effort in terms of the way you're delivering them. And those are not required ki uske bina you can't win. Those are just extra things which can help you impact your principle more. So you can still work with the principle without that, but this just adds to the value of it. Thirdly, framing principle arguments is essential. And I think you all have done like speaker sessions of first, second, third. So I think first may you must have like discussed what framing and characterization looks like, building the world, status quo, all those things. Framing, I think any argument is obviously important, because without that, any analysis becomes irrelevant. But particularly within principles, the first step of talking about theoretical idea, if you don't frame the principle within a debate, I'm very unclear throughout of how do I picturize that? What are you even talking about? So as soon as you picturize the right to freedom of how it looks like today, whenever you talk about the lack of that right, I am able to picturize what it looks like. And picturization is important because it's important that you show me the world you're talking about and give me reasons and give me analysis to say that this is what it's going to look like and this is why it matters so much. Which is why answering basic questions within framing are important for your principles to even exist within the debate. Next is half-baked principles are the worst idea ever. And this is like to say that if you, and this is like linking to the first thing I talked about, that just saying a statement is not a principle. So if you run a principle in a haphazard manner by saying, oh, it's a principle, right? Or you, like, let's say, skip the step of linking to the motion, or you don't prove importance, it's probably worse than not running it. And there are reasons for it. The reason is that principles do take a substantial amount of time in terms of framing to set up, or to analyze, or to explain. So if you don't do it in the fullest manner, and a other side can easily take it down, you've probably wasted a substantial time of your debate. And the way I look at debates is very simple. If it's an APD, you have 21 minutes to make concrete arguments or to convince the judge that you're right. In BPs, you have even less, it's just 14 because it's just two speakers. Which means that the way you manage your time in terms of the arguments you're prioritizing is extremely important. Principles require that amount of time. And if you fail to ground the principles to the fullest extent, you have probably wasted a time within that time you've established or tried to establish a principle, because you haven't proven every bit of that principle. So never half bake those principles. If you want to run a principle, make sure you're able to run it properly, and don't mix this with like कि अगर principle चला रहे तो like सब कुछ भूल के बस यही चलाना है, and don't think of the other side or compare your arguments, because those things are important. So the basics remain same. You can't always win on just saying your world is good. You have to comparatively prove it to be better than the other side, and which is why being comparative in all arguments is important. So these are basic things which have to ensure that the principle is fully grounded and not half baked, because running that is a bad idea. And I know this because I have run principles in a lot of debates in the first 6 months of my debating, and I have continuously lost all rounds. Not because I was bad or the other team was very good, simply because my time management and the way I was making those principles was so shallow that it was very easy for the other side to take down. So which is why, from experience, I'm telling you that get a grasp on principles, try and run them within case preps, within like mocks, etc., uh, to ensure that whenever you do run them in rounds, you're able to ground them so well that they aren't half baked, or judges don't tell you that, oh, this linking was missing within that principle. Because that's the worst feeling ever, knowing that you identified the right thing which could have helped the debate, but you fail to do it. So make sure that your principle is fully run. Lastly, good principles can win you debates independently as opposed to the popular narrative. And this is important because I think, as at least what I've seen through the last 2 years, I don't think that oftentimes within the Delhi University circuit or the Indian circuit, at least from what I've like seen, I don't think people have a large idea of, or are open to the idea of principles winning debates, because you'll often hear people say that, oh, principles are nice and all, but they can never win you debates, or it's very easy to just counter principle by saying, oh, these are 10 impacts. I tend to disagree with that, which is why I think principles are important to establish as soon as you learn debating and the basics of it, so that when you go and judge tomorrow and when you go and speak tomorrow, you value these as much as you value other pragmatic arguments. I think in certain instances, principles can independently win you debates, and this looks like very simple, right? There are often debates and motions where impacts or any sort of consequences are very difficult to establish, difficult or muddy, or just there is no exclusivity of your impact, all these issues. What does this mean, right? This means that gov is arguing something, op is arguing something in terms of impacts, but I'm unsure whether जो gov बोल रही है, why will it always accrue in gov's world, why can't it also operate in ops world, things like that, right? Which means oftentimes what happens is impact debates में debates do get muddled where it's a deadlock. It's like, oh, they proved two impacts. As a judge, I'm unsure whether why either of those impacts are so important or crucial to either side, and why are they even important. In such motion and such debates, principles can independently win you debates. There are two reasons. One, they don't require any consequences to take place for them to be established, as we talked about earlier. But secondly, good principles oftentimes do not need to be explicitly weighed up against each of the impacts which the other side is proving. Let's say you prove the principle of right to autonomy. The other side is saying that no, there are three impacts or three things which will happen if we violate it, which is why it's a good thing. If you've established why autonomy matters so much and why the violation of it's a bad thing, you don't need to independently say that, oh, this is important because this X thing is wrong or this Y thing is wrong. You have proven the larger idea. You've proven why the principle of autonomy is a bad thing. Hence, any consequence which the other side is saying is something which you've already disproven just by establishing a principle. So why they can win you debates independently is also that you don't need to independently engage with a lot of matter coming from the other side, insofar as your larger principle takes care of those ancillary ideas. So these are 5 things which are like to keep in mind about principles, to view them as any other arguments, to ensure that you have rhetoric to support the impact of it, framing them crucially, not running them half baked, and lastly, that remembering that these things can win you debates and valuing them as much as other arguments. And the last thing is important, just the way future debaters come forward and they do look at this as important and not just think of this as, oh, isse kuch hota nahi. If you run it correctly, you will win debates. That's the larger idea within this. Any doubts before we go to the next slide? Yep, Deepika, go ahead.
Yeah. So, what then becomes a tipping point in debates where the competing ideas are not principle versus pragmatics, rather principle versus principle on both sides?
Cool. And that's actually a very good question, because the way you deal with principles is often, one way of them is by countering with the like counter principle. So a bad way to deal with the principle is saying, oh, your principle incorrect hai and all that. Don't waste too much time within that. One very strategic way is by providing a counter principle. So let's say Gov provides a principle, Op says sure, but this other principle is violated if that principle exists. Now we have two principles at hand. This is where weighing can be done. This is where a couple of questions, and I think Vrinda did your like idea of weighing metrics and all those. She did cover that, right? This is where metrics can become important. That which of these metrics are more relevant to the stakeholders? Which of these metrics are causing a larger degree of harm, or are of more importance to these vulnerable individuals? Things like that. Because if you have two counter principles or two principles on hand, proving why one matters more than the other by using the metrics which you already learned about, then becomes a tipping point to win a debate. That there are two principles. I'll prove to you why this matters more. For example, if you have right to life versus right to choice, I know we equated both of these things, but if the right to choice misses that analysis or misses that link, you can prove why right to life is a prerequisite to any other right. So if you don't live, or if you're unable to live properly, the right to choose, the right to freedom, the right to speak can't ever happen, right? Because if you can't live, you can't have the freedom. So you probably, another metric to prove is that this is prior to the other thing. uh, right to life is prior to all other rights. That's one way a tipping point can be established, for example. So the tipping point when there are two principles is often the metrics you use to establish why one matters more than the other. And we'll come to that in the second last slide when we talk about how you rebut principles largely. But this is one way to do it. You use the metrics you learn in terms of weighing and weigh your principle over the other principle. That's the larger way to do it. Perfect. We'll go to the next slide now. Cool. Now we're going to talk about two larger principles, or just two ideas of what principles can look like. The first is about reparations, and I think we've talked about like some part of reparations where we took examples of colonialism and all those things. So, what is the principle of reparation? What does it look like? And then we'll also take a motion to get a brief understanding of it. One, it's often used to depict harms of colonialism in countries, something which you already discussed. That the way reparations are normally used or talked about is to show the grave harms which were caused in colonies by countries which had asymmetric power over these countries. Examples we've already taken, right? And reparations se pehle you have to show why these harms are so grave for the reparations to be existing as a concept as well, right? Secondly, discusses the idea of recompense given to someone who has been exploited or caused harm to by another person. So apart from colonialism, reparations are, or reparations as an idea is me owing something to somebody else if that individual has been caused harm to by me. So, for example, I go ahead and cause harm to a society or an individual. The principle of reparation can now be pushed to me, that I need to go and recompense something to that person, to that individual, to that society, because I was the one who caused harm to them. So that's how it necessarily operates. It's forced on the people who caused that harm to other individuals or the society or whatever, right? That's the way it necessarily is seen. And thirdly, proportionality is crucial, which means the amount of uh, the degree of reparations you are expecting from me has to be in lines with the degree of harm I caused. Which means you can't say that, oh, I caused a harm of 50 rupees, but I need to give, let's say, 1,000 rupees. There has to be some sort of proportionality. That if the harm caused was this grave, the recompensation procedure or the owing reparation in terms of vulnerability should be equal to that. So, for example, it's like if a country colonized another country for hundreds of years, took away all their resources, violated a lot of rights of their individuals, this country can't come up and say, here is 10,000 rupees for the problem we caused. Why? Because it's not proportional to the harm that they caused, which means proportionality in this principle is important for the principle to exist. That's the larger idea. Let's take a motion quickly to get a brief understanding of what we talked about. This house believes that countries with colonial past owe reparation to the countries they colonize. So this is not really an inherent motion which I've taken from a tab. I think this is something which is very intuitive, and this is where I give another shout out again to Shahid Tharoor's speech, and I would highly recommend you to go and watch that. It's his speech which Mr. Tharoor gave in, I think, again, might be wrong, in a university where there was a debate going about whether Britain owes reparations to its colonies or not. And it was about the idea of the larger idea of the acknowledgement of owing reparations versus actually paying them. So the debate was whether the acknowledgement of owing this reparation should happen, or there is no reparation which Britain owes. मतलब कुछ गलत नहीं किया, so there should not be any reparation which should be owed. So Shahid Tharoor's speech in that talks a lot about this sort of topic and the principle of reparation. So that video is actually going to give you a very good idea of how you can actually do all the three steps of how we talked about constructing a principle that probably there in that speech alone. So, and again, this might be a bit fanboy thing, but yeah, I love that speech till date, and I've used that in a lot of correct, Oxford 2015, correct. And I have referred to this in a lot of debates. I think CVS quarterfinals last year, I think there was some debate about uh, owing reparations or taking away rights from individuals. So I think I use the same sort of mech which was used in that speech, applying it to that motion. And this is why a lot of content which you go and see, you can use it like this. So I think watching that will probably help. The idea within this is that the reason why these countries need to owe reparations is because the money which these countries have, or the amount of development which these countries have been able to create, is due to the exploitation of the colonies it has gone ahead and established. To say that the reason why X country owes a reparation to the Y country they colonized is because the very reason that this X country is as developed as they are today is because in the past they colonized the other country. They took away their resources. They took benefits which that country should have had. They took away rights of individuals which they should not have taken away. These basic factors, right? Which means the way to establish a principle of reparation is by first proving why there is a need for that in the first place. Hence, going to the first step, which we talked about. What does this contextualize it? What is the theoretical idea of this reparation? Uh, this is the idea that this is why the exploitation was done. This can look like these countries owing some sort of thing to these countries. Secondly, oftentimes, let's say Shahid speech, right? There is acknowledgement among the masses as well that this needs to be done because they understand the consequences that they were caused by this colonization. That's the first step. Second step, and let's talk about this motion. Gav says that there is some sort of reparation which need to be owed. Within this, linking to the motion says, once I've shown you what reparation as a concept looks like, now I show you that countries with colonial past do owe these reparations because one, they did it on a regular basis. So this one wasn't a one-time issue. I think these countries had a colonial mindset. They always had a mindset to go ahead and exploit other countries for their own benefits. Secondly, the harms they cause are very, very big every single time they did it. Thirdly, they are the very cause why the country they've colonized have been unable to grow today exponentially, or even if they've grown, they've taken a substantial time to first get out of that colonial like liabilities that they had, the issues they had, to then focus on development. These are reasons why within this motion it's important that these reparations are owed, because these are the link, this is the linking which I've done, that without this is what happens. Without this acknowledgement of reparations, these countries continue to go ahead and develop without ever having a moral obligation to other countries which they've colonized. मतलब अगर तुम ये reparation नहीं हो करवाते आज उनसे, these people are literally going, these countries continue to grow on other people's resources, and that's wrong, because that sends out a message that anybody can exploit anybody without ever having to cause have some sort of repaying actions later on. And that's a moral bad for the people who have been colonized, who have a colonized past. That's the way linking can be done. And thirdly, by proving its importance, that the reason why this is important to a lot of individuals is that oftentimes what colonialism leaves behind is not just the liabilities and the lack of development, it's the mental harm which is caused. That till date, a lot of individuals within this country have not yet gone out of this colonial mindset, which is why they sometimes see the Western countries or the Western bloc as automatically smarter than us or automatically better than us or whatever it is. So, which is why I'm saying the reason why this reparation becomes important is because without it, this sort of mindset never gets changed, or we never realize that they actually did something which was wrong. Which is why in current status quo also it becomes important to establish it, so that these countries don't keep getting away with doing things like these. This is the principle of reparation. Can often be used in colonialism impacts. It can often be used, uh, for example, the Indian government owing reparations uh, to individuals they caused harm when they took a certain policy step, or owing reparations through reservations, right? I think reservation was a concept which came up after our independence. We continue to give that reservation because we have to owe reparation to the individuals which have caused harm in the past. That is why we give them reservation, because those are the individuals which have faced so many harm, the generations have faced so many harm in the past, which is why we owe some sort of reparation to them. These are certain examples of debates where reparations as a concept or as a principle can be used. And that's the motion I give you an example of. Uh, any doubts within the principle of reparations. And the second point becomes important. It discusses the idea of recompense given to someone who has been exploited or caused harm to by another person. So this statement alone can be a good hint for you to identify principles. So let's say you see a motion. If you see this statement being applicable there, you probably can use the principle of reparation. You can ask yourself that, okay, is there an individual which has caused harm to another individual, or let's say a group of individuals in the past, due to which there are being effects faced today? And if the motion is talking about this person now owing something or forcing them to pay something back, why could that be? It's probably because of the principle of reparation. So these basic factors, if you keep in mind, you'll be able to intuitively link motions with the principle you want to use in that motion. So, any doubts within the principle of reparations, how you can use them? What are these? What is this principle? And the example which you just took. Yep, go ahead, Dipsika.
It might sound a little like stupid as a counter, but can side op come ahead and run that? But these are not the same set of people who actually caused harm. So why do they in present owe reparation to these people?
Absolutely, that's actually not a stupid thing at all. That's a legit argument against reparations. So even in that debate which you're talking about, I think a lot of people on the other side did argue this as well. That these are not individuals today or not the government today which took that step. Hence, why should they be responsible for it? So there are ways to deal with it. The first way to deal with it is that sure, but the benefits these individuals also got in their years where they grew up was also because of the very colonization. So, uh, for example, England today, sure, the current government is not responsible for this, but the reason why the government operates in a way which it operates today is literally because years back England developed into a country using the resources of other colonies. So sure, direct link nahi hai, but the country or the society you live in is created by the resources you took away from the colonies. So वो generational effect तो कभी भी नहीं जाएगा उसका. The building block of your society is based on colonies. Hence, you are legally responsible for it. Legally, as in you are morally responsible for it because you have gained the benefits also from it. So, for example, I think Barack Obama came and talked about. I don't know the exact words. I'm not going to say the exact thing, but I think did talk about a previous harm which was done in some other government, and the acknowledgement was given by Mr. Barack Obama separately, even though that government was not really responsible for the action which was taken by the previous government, but that sort of acknowledgement principally was done by that particular president, which probably show you that it's not like always the current government has to do it. Sure, if the current government does it, that's still fine, but it's not like if it reparations automatically goes away if the next generation comes forth. So that's the way you can tackle that. One of them. I think there could be multiple other ways. Cool. Any other doubts within this slide?
Yeah, just a follow up to this question.
Go ahead.
Since reparation is very strong principle, how do we then counter it?
Uh, four ways which you're going to discuss. One of them by proving why you can co-opt the principle by saying that if the idea is of owing reparations, we can do it in another way. Which is why this motion is probably like this. That's why this is not a worldly motion. For example, I think there was a debate upon oh yeah, so CVS quarters last year, CVS parliamentary debate 2022. The motion talked about the political parties today should now focus on new rights or providing newer rights to individuals what are demanded today, rather than focusing on the basic rights which had to be provided pehle. So for example, like things like reservation, things like equality, which are important pehle, today there are other rights coming up. What should be prioritized? The principle we ran, I think, and we did win the debate, was one we established why, without acknowledging the previous rights, you can never go ahead and ever move forward, because आज के rights are also linked with those rights. अगर equality नहीं होगी, reservation नहीं होगी, तो आगे right to choice, right to freedom का matter ही नहीं होगा. Which is why governments do need to acknowledge those things in the past. Now coming to how to tackle that, one way to tackle that could be, if your idea is that the acknowledgement needs to be done of previous rights, I think we can subsequently do that same thing on the other side while talking about these newer rights. Let's say the one side has to say that forget the or don't focus on the previous historical things, focus on current requirements. Op says no, acknowledging that is important because principle of reparation. Gov can say, okay, if your idea that needs to be acknowledged, I think by providing these rights today, what people demand today, that can be done at the same time while providing a message that we are now doing these rights, giving these rights because the previous government couldn't, or because that time it wasn't possible. Hence, we are doing it more right now. Now the debate shifts. Now it becomes about, if the side is co-opting that principle, now it becomes about who is able to achieve the end impact of the principle better. That's one way. Second way is by proving why the principle is not applicable within that context. The other side can say that your idea is fair, but I don't think it applies in this debate, because I don't think moving forward about talking about current ideas and current rights takes away from the acknowledgement which has already been done in the past. Hence, it's a problem solution mismatch. You'll hear this a lot. So the one way to counter that is also this, that by proving why there's a mismatch within that. But I'll come to rebutting principles. There's 2 slides on it, and I want to wait it for there. But there are 4 ways you can rebut principle, which are any principle at all. So we'll come to that, but these are 2 quick ways which you can rebut this idea of principle. Cool. We'll come to rebutting them later on. We'll move to the next principle now, which is responsibility. Right. Within this, there are 2 ideas. What does this principle look like? One, owing a responsibility to individuals, groups, or even society at large. So it can be, and it can be any of these things, right? It can probably be that I have a responsibility to another individual because of the asymmetric relationship we have. I owe a responsibility to the society I live in because I literally use the society's resources at a daily basis. What I do does affect how the society operates. Hence, I do owe something to the society. Secondly, this may be inherent or caused due to certain action, and this is very, very important. For example, the responsibility I have as a parent to a child is almost inherent. It's inherent because I am the parent. I took a decision to have the child. Versus that responsibility being created due to certain actions. And this is the example, right? Parents versus companies' exploitation of environment. For example, there are debates which say that companies need to go ahead and pay higher amount of taxes if they go ahead and harm the environment or cause pollution, whatever it is, right? Do companies automatically have a responsibility towards the environment? No. They have a responsibility because they profit from exploiting the environment. तो जब फैक्ट्रीज में से pollution होके they produce goods, that's when companies are able to derive profit from this. Which means because of this action, companies now owe a responsibility to the environment because their growth is contingent on the exploitation of the environment. So the difference is that one is an inherent responsibility, the other is caused due to an action, caused due to the harm you did. So the companies harmed the environment, which is now they have continuous responsibility to now ensure that they do benefit in some cause or the other. There are 2 ways that responsibility can operate. We'll take a motion here as well, and this is a motion of Nalsar Ivy quarterfinals of this year, tournament in Hyderabad. I was speaking there as well. The motion is, this house believes that parents should teach their daughters to distrust men. This was a quarterfinals motion, and this was a BP motion, so it was used in a British parliamentary debate format. I was at opening government, and it's actually a very, very strong debate for all opening governments or all teams on the opening government bench, because in all 4 rooms of that quarterfinals, I think we saw the motion and everybody started hooting. So it's a good motion to debate on, especially if you're at OG. So all opening governments within that round went through. So this is actually a very, very strong motion for opening government. The side agreeing with this, And that's the reason why all sides went through. And we'll discuss this right now. A couple of ideas in this. Firstly, what does the current world look like? The reason why we were able to win that debate was literally on this one question, or literally on just the one frame. What does the current world look like? And this is to prove the need of this. Okay, why should parents teach their daughters to distrust men? Because the world is probably messed up right now, right? So the first question is to be important. What does the current world look like? The way we try to prove it, or we try to analyze it, is that right now the world may be developed, the world may be seen as modern or liberal, but it's just surface level. There are literal realities where we can see that the world is still an unsafe place for a lot of individuals. It's still an unsafe place for a lot of people coming forth, being born today. A lot of parents are still worried about sending their daughters outside, things like these, which means the reality of today's world is very, very different from what the governments want you to believe, that, oh, we are a very safe country. No, you're not, right? So to properly analyze and characterize that this world is not a safe place for anybody right now, as governments want you to, on the opposite side, may want you to believe. The second thing is, and this is where a preemption was done, right? We preempted something coming from opposition. We said parents are going to teach their daughters something regardless. So in this debate, you don't change what or whether parents teach something or not. I think if the world looks as bad as the first thing, parents are probably going to say something to their daughters always, right? That things like be careful or whatever it is. What we argued was that it's better to teach since the beginning that you should distrust men rather than teaching them that be careful of their actions. I think that's prior. What we argued was that it's better to tell them to distrust men so that they never have to come into a situation where men can operate in ways which are bad. Which means what we are saying is prior to any bad action taking place, hence it's the best thing ever. The second thing which we argued, and this is where we did a lot of framing, when a parent tells a child something, what are the impacts? And I have about 10 characters I can do on this. I've done this in multiple debates. One, whatever your parent tells you at the age of 5 stays with you at the age of 25. Because children are vulnerable, children are naive. Whatever you tell them stays with them. Second thing could be there's often a asymmetric relationship between children and parents. Between children often look as parents as people who dictate what is right or wrong for them, dictate their morals for them. मतलब जो भी parents बताएंगे शुरू में are seen as right things. The only time we probably start questioning them is when we grow old. But I think initially we all say, oh, if they say go and sit down, we probably know I think sitting down is the right idea, right? Thirdly, any messaging from parents dictates the way I look and perceive the world. Which means if they fit certain values into me, that, oh, lying is bad, safety is important, things like these, they also become an inherent part of the way I look at situations. Now, let's get back to the motion. By establishing all this, we've established that there's a requirement for this step to be taken. Because let's be honest, it's an extreme motion, right? It's a very extreme step to say, oh, distrust all men. But once you establish this entire need, is the only way now you can come to the idea. Then we also said parents have an inherent, and this is the principle we ran, parents have an inherent responsibility to the safety of their children. We've discussed why there's an asymmetric relationship, but we think children are so dependent on these parents, to provide their ethical conduct or the moral conduct, that they require their parents to send them a message which saves them from dire circumstances or which contributes to their safety. We framed all of this. Now we link it to the motion by saying that when parents teach their daughters to distrust men, what happens? What happens is that since a younger age, you probably talk to your parents about a lot more things. When you're in situations which are bad, you're more prone to go to your parents to go and talk about that because you've always been taught that do not trust men, rather distrust them, which means you always look at them with a signal of doubt. Why is that good? It's good because we're not saying, oh, every man is bad, but that's irrelevant. We don't care about that. What we care about is that the instances where a man might be bad, you can automatically save yourself from that situation because you're distrusting them, which means you probably won't agree to whatever they inherently say, won't go to a place with them automatically because you're looking to them with a vision of doubt. Which means in circumstances which may go bad, you are more prone to go ahead and talk to your parents about it because they've literally ingrained in you that you need to distrust men. That's the first question. What does the world look like? You can frame it. Second within this principle is, what is this responsibility which parents owe? Theoretical idea, which we just talked about, right? What is this responsibility of safety? Why does it exist? Thirdly, is analyze the efficacy of this process to achieve responsibility. This is important for the second step, linking to the motion, why the measuring criteria is ensured in your world. The way we had OG said that this can be ensured is by saying कि अगर ये होता है, अगर आप daughters को ये बोलते हो as parents, you ingrain it within them, you ensure that you save them from the worst circumstances. In cases where the circumstances show up, there are more chances of them coming up and talking to you as parents. But fourth, you also go ahead and this is an interesting flip, I think, which just came out CG. Um, the way this operates is also that when the society largely sees this happening, and this might be pragmatic impact पे, but ये principle का ही relation है, grounding into impact, right? And this is a bigger impact, so we didn't really push too much time on it. CG did, I think, but I think this is also fair to say that the more and more you do this, the more and more you try to flip the way society works, in the sense that if men now start seeing that, listen, everybody distrusts us, there's probably a chance for some sort of moral change within them. There's some sort of chance for them to see that, listen, there is a reason why this is being done, right? There is a reason why this step has been taken. The reason I don't think this is the most proximate impact or the most important thing is because what's more valuable is what you teach your daughters, because they are in circumstances where they can save themselves, right? Rather than telling somebody else to change their ways, because uski likelihood aap kabhi nahi prove kar paoge. It's very difficult to prove that. Which is why for the first step answers the efficacy of this. Insofar as you can ingrain this in your daughters, you save them from the worst circumstances and the impacts that you just talked about. Lastly, why is this relevant if achieved? This is the most important. And if you notice, iska thoda bahut to I have already done in framing, because I've already told you why the world is so bad. Hence, we need to take some step. Then I've explained to you why this step principally is the best step to take, because it's a principal responsibility which parents owe. Lastly, the reason why it's important is because without this, I think the worst circumstances we talk about continue to come up more. The conversation between parents and daughters continue to be very, very shallow. And lastly, this asymmetry of power within the society continues to operate, where daughters or individuals who have no way out of bad situations. The way you can achieve that is by this. So there are metrics. So the one metric which instantly we used in DPM was the metric of degree of impact. If this is done, why is this impact so big? Link it back to framing. Why the world is so bad, hence we need to do something. Secondly, degree of vulnerability. Within the current world, if op might say any things are better, they're not. Which means the individuals you're talking about are still very vulnerable. Which means the impact to them is the most important. Thirdly, could be that this is a long-term impact, right? What you teach your children at a younger age is often a long-term impact, which means the success we're able to get is on a long-term basis. These are metrics for you to not only establish the principle, but now win the principle with it. That's, and genuinely speaking, we had some other ancillary arguments ki ye ho jayega, wo ho jayega. What we won was on just this principle. You have an inherent responsibility, why this is the best way to achieve that responsibility in the current world. Notice if you miss any of those 4 steps, other 3 don't make sense. If you don't tell me what the world looks like, I don't care about this responsibility. क्योंकि आप उसको achieve कैसे कर रहे हो, आप solve क्या कर रहे हो? Solve ये कर रहे हो कि current world is bad, hence you want to make it better for people. Let's say you miss the 3rd step, you don't analyze the efficacy of this. So you might be true to say that the world is bad. I am unsure how do you solve it? How do you make anything better for anybody? Hence, all these steps, these are large parts of those 3 steps we discussed, all become important to establish the principle of responsibility, can often be used in multiple debates. This is one example I took, can be used in the companies well example where you owe it back to the environment or something like that. Can also be proven in other things like responsibility to go and vote and all those things. Basics remain same. Any doubts within this? I'll just wait for 10-20 seconds. Just give me 1 minute. I'll just pause for a minute. Till then, let me know in case any doubts. I just have to make a quick call. Cool, I'm back. Any doubts? Let me know. In case not, we can go forward. And this might be a little long, but I think principles as a session does take a lot of time to understand. So, yeah, Deepshika, go ahead.
So there was a motion in some debate tournament
Hmm.
that the even the loss making companies must be made compulsory. This house would make compulsory for even loss making companies to do CSR. So can
Hmm.
in that motion we run that there's an inherent responsibility for the companies, irrespective of whether they are profiting or like in a loss, to do CSR, because in the first place they like took away or like had the lands, or maybe they benefited from the grants government gives, or like the kind of benefits they provide for businesses to initially set up, etc.
Correct, exactly. That's the thing document, that's the way to prove the need. So, within that, I think so. The way the motion is said is that the loss making wala part is to, if you remove the loss making wala part, it's very intuitive. There's only government, right? There's to say, yaar, matlab, haan, obviously, companies should give CSR. They have added the loss making aspect, which means now you need to push your principle even further. You need to really establish it. कि ये ऐसा प्रिंसिपल है कि regardless of loss हो या कुछ भी हो, this needs to be done. Why is that the case? Firstly, one very important framing is a company which had a loss today can be the most profitable company tomorrow. You don't know, right? Which means this loss wala aspect is not like oh loss mein hai, so it continues to stay in losses. Companies are smart enough to come out of losses again and again when the market grows or whatever. That's an important framing. Secondly, is by saying that companies often benefit, as you said, on the land of restricted land, right? They take away land from a lot of individuals who were staying there. They make factories in places that people were living. They take grants from governments, which means governments are paying taxpayers' money to these people. So you give taxes to the government, they allocate this money. So yeah, this government is now allocating this benefit to these factories, to these companies. All these things prove that this sort of asymmetric need for these companies to do something for the society exists regardless. This is the first step. Second step, linking with the motion. Why this needs to be done even in loss-making situations is because if you make exceptions for them, I think it puts companies in a situation where they might start showing losses to get away with this responsibility. Hence, you need to do it even when the responsibility exists. But secondly, I think it pushes companies to prioritize CSR as a concept on a much larger basis. But thirdly, the reason why this principle is so important is because ये losses में करना तभी जरूरी है because when the companies come in a profit, they come to that profit by this exploitation, by continue to using that land, by continuing to extract benefit from the government, all those things. Which means the situation of the company in being in a profit or loss does not change the established thing that this is coming from other people's benefit or other people's money. Which means, just give me a second. Sorry about that. Just give me a second. Yep. So yeah, so it means regardless of what the situation of the company, whether it's a profit or a loss, the established metric that the company has benefited from other people's things is going to remain regardless. Which is why even in loss-making situations, this principle needs to be go ahead and continue. Because where this principle continues, that's where the people from the CSR can actually benefit. So that's the idea around that company's well aspect. Let me know if that's clear or if you have a follow-up question to this.
Yes. So actually, what the other side ended up running was that due to COVID and things like that, a lot of companies or the startups that are like initially set up would be disincentivized, because generally when you set up startup, it's like a very risky field in business. There's no like surety of whether you'll have profit or loss initially, and in most cases loss is the like option that you have for like some initial months or maybe 1 or 2 year when you open like a startup. So it would disincentivize people to go ahead and enter into like open up startups, etc. So that's the main idea that they like push, and they
That's
won this debate like.
that's fair. So the reason why they're able to win this debate, at least from what I can think, is because they're able to provide a situation or an impact which is situational. If this happens, this will incentivize people, disincentivize people from coming up, and so it's a big impact. The reason is that, and this is where weighing becomes important. your principle needs to be so grounded well and seen as such a big thing that the judge values that at an equal thing to the disincentivization. So one way is further working on your principle, making sure that the all three steps are even done on a graver nature, on a much more impactful nature. But the second thing to deal with this, and this you can respond directly to their impact, is that, and I've heard this argument a lot, that you disincentivize companies from coming up, etc., etc. Two responses, and this point can be out. One, there are counter incentives for companies to come up which are going to exist regardless. The reason why people start companies is not just because CSR nahi karna padega. It's because they want to earn money which they cannot earn anywhere else, because this allows them the freedom which corporate jobs don't. This allows them the time which corporate jobs don't. This allows them to follow a passion which they've worked on for years. All these reasons are much more important as incentivization for these people than this one thing causing a disincentivization. So you can weigh it up, right? Okay, what you're saying may be true, but I don't think that becomes a tipping point for people to not to start these startups, because these are other factors which go ahead and motivate them regardless. And these factors are much more important. So we don't think the number of startups which come up can ever change, even this may sound true on theory. The second thing is, through CSR, image building of a company also works, right? Which means if I'm a company who says, look, I'm in losses, but I'm still providing CSR, people actually love that company. The reason why people love Tata today is because Ratan Tata doesn't take any money himself, but goes and donates largely to NGOs and whatnot, right? Which means that Tata is very valued as a company. It's seen as a company which is largely doing good for the society. So people do this because they want the perception of the company to be good regardless. So we don't think that disincentivization can work. These are two independent responses which can break that claim, and further working and weighing up on your principle through the steps which it does discuss can also help that independently be weighing against any of the things that they're saying. So this is more important than anything else. And I think ulta kar do. Once we establish companies will come up regardless, then this principle becomes even more important. Okay, it's not like startups won't come up. And once they do come up, which I've proven to you by those two independent things, then this principle needs to be ensured. So that's the way you can work around that in that debate.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No worries. Cool. Any other doubts? Right. Cool. Then we can just go on to the next thing. Moving to the next slide. Right, these are the last, I think, last two slides within this, which, and now we come to the idea of, we've understood what principles look like, we've discussed a couple of principles, we've talked about what principles don't look like, we've talked about things to keep in mind. Now once that's understood, how do you at the receiving end of a principle from the other side deal with them? And this is an important part which also I think people don't necessarily know. If people know how to run principles, they oftentimes don't know how to deal with them, which means if what I've explained to you till now is true, okay, oh, principles are so good, how do you beat them? Because then though it's like unbeatable, it sounds, right? Four ways to beat them. One, you make it inapplicable. And this is a unique way to do it, because you can't always prove or analyze why the principle is wrong, quote unquote, right? You can't say, oh, agency to important nahi hai, ya phir agency ka principle is untrue, because it's very tricky to do. There are ways to do it, but I think it's very difficult to normally prove it. Second thing is, prove why it does not apply in the current scenario. That's something you can do. For example, brain drain. And I think we'll take this quick example here. Oftentimes, people say that, oh, I as an individual should not go abroad or to study because brain drain ho jayega, my country loses out on people, etc., etc. The reason why it does not apply in a scenario where I choose to go or not, because I might have to choose for reasons which are out of my control. For example, right? Or is brain drain really a big factor to the country as a whole? And this is important, I think. On a side note also, I think reading up on brain drain is important, because it's not as black and white as people say, oh, people go abroad, it's a bad thing. Because once people go abroad, they also provide ancillary benefits back home. Because once we go abroad, I send my earnings back probably, or I make large scale investments to not be able to pay tax in that country by investing in my own country, things like these, right? Which means it's not always that, oh, brain drain is a bad thing. Which means I can prove by the principle of me owing something to my country does not apply in the case of brain drain because of these reasons. Which means you've made the principle inapplicable. You don't disagree with the principle of responsibility or my responsibility to my own country. You think that's fair. You just think that it can't apply under this motion. Which means when we talk about identification of motion and principle, it also needs to be done on the other side. So if you're at a receiving end and you can probably see that I'm off, gov pe probably I can see a principle operating. Once you know what principle is operating within that debate, you also automatically know what principle is not. Which means whenever the other principles come up, you can work on analyzing why that principle does not apply in this sort of scenario. That's one way to deal with the principle, making it inapplicable, not applying in this scenario which we're talking about, the world we're talking about. That's one thing. Second is weighing it up with another principle. And this is, I think, we talked about once the question came about how you deal with two principles, right? You can probably deal with the principle by the proving the importance of your own principle which you provided. This is in cases where you also as a side do bring up a principle and the other side does it as well. We'll take an example here as well. Proving security over any other right. So oftentimes there are rights which have to be weighed in terms of right to security, right to life, versus uh, right to freedom, like we talked about, right? The way you can win this debate by proving right to life as a principle, first you have to prove it, the other steps we talked about. Once you do that, the weighing can be simple, that right to life is important. Not only does it impact other individuals to a larger degree, but it's prior to any other right. If you don't live, or if you don't have the security of being able to live, any impact of freedom, choice, agency is irrelevant, because living comes prior to that, a prerequisite to all that. Which is why proving security over any other right is something which is of more importance or of much more weighable impact than anything else. So just I'll give 20 seconds here. You can just read up on the slide. In case there are any doubts, let me know when I being move on to the next one. Just give me 10. Yeah. Let me know if there are any doubts with these two methods of rebutting them. Then we can go to the last two of them. Inapplicable. Okay, I'll do that. Cool. So making it something inapplicable means not disagreeing with the larger idea of it. So if side argues right to agency and all the thing right to agency is important, agency is a basic part of everybody's life, etc., etc. Making it inapplicable does not mean that you are disagreeing with agency being important. So you don't try and break that idea, because I think it's very difficult to break that. What you do is the second step. You prove why the right to that agency does not apply as a principle within this motion or within this scenario. So probably saying as a side that, listen, you might be right, but I don't think you can ever allow this right to agency in this motion. So if the motion talks about, let me take an example. Let's say it talks about lockdown during COVID, whether that's something which is a problem or not, right? I think an instant rebuttal, instant principle can probably be right to freedom and all those things, right? You can say right to freedom is true, but it is often not applicable universally. And even within our constitution, right, rights exist, but they never exist in a vacuum. Which means oftentimes there are situations when governments do have to strip away rights for the larger benefit. Because, and this is where you reverse the thing, you prove why right to freedom is not the most important here or is inapplicable here, because it can never be achieved for anybody. If we are taking away right to freedom for me, it's not like we aren't taking it for this other person, right? Which means it's not applicable only to me, or it's not being only taken away from me. Which means the right to freedom for me as an individual, as a principle in this debate, is not applicable fully, because it also applies to other individuals for the larger good. So you're not disagreed with that freedom is important. You are just saying that it can't be applied under this scenario because this is an exceptional scenario. So you're not taking it on a general basis, you're taking it away right now. Things like this. So making it inapplicable basically means proving why it's not applicable within this scenario, even if it may be true. Cool. Any other doubts here? Perfect. Moving to the next slide. Two more ways of rebutting principles. One is co-opting. Next is direct rebuttals. Co-opting, and this is very fun if you're able to do it. You can explain why you are achieving the desired outcome better, or you're able to achieve the same outcome. So probably to say that if one side says we want to continue to give the right to freedom, and it goes away in your world, the world which Gov side is talking about. Op says that right to freedom is important, right to freedom is going away in Gov, and we want to continue right to freedom. At Gov, either you can do the first two things you talked about, or you can just say, in fact, right to freedom is better achieved in our world. or it's equally achieved. uh, because, and this is why, like, you don't waste the time in rebutting the entire idea of, oh, right to freedom is bad, right to freedom nahi ho jaye, and all this thing. You just say, sure, it's better in our side. For example, cool. So this way, right? Even lockdown way, you can say, on a short term, taking away the right to freedom ensures that right to freedom exists better in the long term. So if you take away this right now, curb the spread of COVID, you're probably able to solve COVID as a virus and like come up with the solution to it much quicker, because you don't let it spread. Which means allowing people to then come up and roam around probably 1 or 2 months later is something which is of a greater benefit. Which means what you're saying is that we are also giving right to freedom to individuals, but we're giving it a different time because it's more important to give it them because it's more long term. There are probably other motions also within this. It's not the best example. The best example can be which where there is it's achieved at the same time, right? Um, right to, so for example, right to security, right to safety, right? I think so. This is where we can go to the Nalsar quarters debate as well. In that debate, opposition argued, this was a very fair claim. Opposition argued that we also want to teach our daughters something. It's not like we're saying don't teach anything to them or don't care about their safety. The way we want to go ahead and apply the principle of responsibility is by teaching them things which is not distrusting men, but by teaching them things in a much more nuanced way. That's something which opening opposition argued, which is very, very fair claim. They didn't disagree that the principle of responsibility does not exist for parents. They said it does exist. The way they tried to co-opt it is that say that they said we are better able to cater to that responsibility towards providing a safe environment when we don't just blanketly say, oh, distrust all men. We probably give them nuanced ways that, in this situation probably do this, in this situation you can do this, all these things. So they, what they said was that, okay, you're right, we also want to give that responsibility to parents to like care about safety, but not the way which you are doing it. We want to do it in a different way. This is co-opting the same impact, same principle. You want to achieve it in a different way. So the way we tackled that was by saying that if the trade-off is कि अच्छा हमारे world में nuance नहीं है, हमारे world में blanket statement में distrust all men, it's better because it saves you from different situations. On opposition, the only way you can talk about that nuanced approach is when it actually comes up, which is bad because we don't want the situation to even come up. That's the thing. So that's how we beat that analysis. But that's also a fair claim on opposition. Same impact, just a different methodology. And why that method is better. Their argument was that blanketly hating all men is probably going to trigger men to be do worse things as well, or become much more worse than what they are right now. So both fair analysis, and the way they try to deal with our principle is by co-opting it. Because beating that principle on gov on any in any room is very difficult. So that's called co-opting. Lastly, it's about direct rebuttals, and this is, I think, if you've talked about rebuttals or if there have been any session on rebuttal responses, this is the same application as you do other rebuttals to any other impacts. Let's say the impact is that people lose money, and the way you rebut that is by saying, oh, how it never it doesn't happen, or how it's not that much money, whatever it is. The same sort of mechanization for rebuttals can also be used here. The way you can do that, second point, oftentimes how do you rebut something, right? You can probably say that, listen, this is untrue because your analysis misses this important link for it to be proven. Because you'd never prove that sure people lose money, but why you never prove why they're unable to ever get it back much more later on. This is a rebuttal, right? Which means we tell you that they're able to get better in the future, which means it's fine to let go of this money right now. So this sort of direct responses to principles can also exist as they exist for normal arguments in general, right? So for example, if the say thing is like, oh, principle responsibility needs to be upholded, a simple response to that could be that there's missing link in your analysis to prove why it's ever upheld in your world. Insofar as it goes away in your world as well, we're unsure as to why it's an exclusive harm in our side. So you just saw that argument, and this is why within debates as well, it's also important to have the judge mindset. Judge the other side's arguments, see the flaws which exist, see the links which are missing, and exploit them by saying, oh, this is the missing link. We'll provide you that link and prove why what we are saying is logically prior or more important than what they are saying. And that is the way you can directly respond, rebut their argument, rebut their principle without having to do other three things. Not saying that any of these four methods can't be combined. Oftentimes, these things can be combined as well. You can also rebut a principle and also co-opt the same, or no, not co-opt, rebut a principle and also weigh your principle over theirs. Oftentimes, weighing your principle over theirs also involves first rebutting their principle as a whole. So there can be combinations here, but these are the four large ways where you can go and how you deal and respond to principles largely. Direct rebuttals by co-opting, weighing your principles, and lastly making it inapplicable as a concept within that debate. So these are the four ways you can rebut principles. Let me know if there are any doubts within this. This is the last part of the session. So any doubts within this or any other slide, just let me know.